I think it could be, but I think, I think the bigger story is that just the fund has more, competition now.
Right.
And so if anyone's familiar with, say, equity closed-end funds, they often do trade at a discount to NAV. That's basically, the market's way of kind of, factoring out the expense ratio of the fund, which tends to be higher than, say, passive ETFs, for example. And so if a closed-end fund has a 1% fee, it might trade at a 10% discount to NAV, and so you're basically factoring out 10 years worth of the management's fees. That's pretty common practice in the space, and so it's actually pretty uncommon for these funds to trade at a premium to NAV.
Right.
And so, but Grayscale was, because it was such a unique product. It had such, alpha to it, and so it was the only game in town for a while. And so, actually, kind of the natural state is to have roughly zero or a slightly negative discount to NAV. Now, I think, when it reaches as low as like almost 20%, that I think that's excessive. That's pretty uncommon for
Yeah.
closed-end funds to do. So there's still kind of an arbitrage trade where if it ever gets really low, it tends to probably be, a trade where you want to maybe go long that fund, and then, if you're trying to make it neutral, then you can short Bitcoin. And so until that kind of that compresses a little bit. But overall, I think that, the Grayscale Bitcoin Trust going into negative, under NAV isn't necessarily tied to institutional interest. You can
Right.
have that go negative while there's still interest in other products.
Yeah, and then when it goes extremely negative, then you have that mean reversion trade. It's just
Exactly.
assuming that it's going to come back, of course. So how much of a concern then are the future GBTC unlocks? Because now that they're not buying, and we know that price has dropped, and people are going to have their 6 month unlock happen soon. What does that mean for the market?
So that's certainly a volatility event. I mean, basically, because the Bitcoin is not redeemable from the fund, it's a little bit different dynamics than, say, if they could just kind of redeem Bitcoin, or basically if Grayscale had more of a mechanism to sell Bitcoin. At the current time, the only way they sell Bitcoin is they're gradually drawing down their Bitcoin from paying their expenses, but that's at a 2% rate per year. But I do think the lockup periods can add a period of volatility. But I think, as far as Grayscale is concerned, I think the primary damage is done there. And so I'm kind of looking at other factors, like, say, the Bitcoin mining hash rate migration, as well as, anything else on the ESG front, or the regulatory front. Those are factors that I think could move price a little bit more. Then I'm also just watching the underlying, network build out, like the things that are happening in the Lightning Network, things that are happening in El Salvador, the different partnerships that firms like NYDIG are doing with banks to make it, more access points for the protocol, things like that.
What's your take on the Chinese hash rate migration? I mean, I've sort of taken the opinion that it's a short term pain for a long term gain sort of situation. Obviously, it decentralizes mining out of China to some degree and probably moves more towards renewables, which seems to be the narrative at the moment. What do you think it means if China this time is really banning mining?
So that's pretty much the consensus take, and I haven't disagreed with that at all. I think, my opinion on would match yours, and it's not, I've seen a lot of other people express that view, that essentially, this can result in some forced sellers. This can result in just kind of a hassle in the space in the near term. But, one of the long-standing criticisms of Bitcoin is that, by most estimates, more than half of the hash rate was out of China. And so, for people that understand the way the protocol works, they know that the nodes actually have quite a lot of power, along with the miners. And so we saw that play out in 2017. And so, I never considered the hash rate concentration quite as big of a risk as some of the critics would say, but it was definitely still a non-zero risk. It was also, even if it's not a huge technical risk, and still be a narrative risk, it's something that critics could point to. And so if China's hash rate does go down significantly, especially if it goes under 50% or even way lower than 50%, and that hash rate gets more distributed, that I think is a long-term gain for Bitcoin. It kind of removes some of the biggest criticisms. So one is you don't have Chinese coal going into it, and two, you don't have, the threat of, China's government, say, capturing all the Bitcoin miners and then trying to do a 51% attack or something crazy like that. So basically, all of those risks are removed. Now, it also removes some renewable sources, right? So people use the hydroelectric extra capacity in the wet season to mine Bitcoin. So that that's apparently going to be removed. And so it's I think it's not fully clear how that will affect say the total energy mix that Bitcoin uses, because you're basically taking away one of the dirtiest sources as well as one of the the free clean sources. So I think that that kind of remains to be seen.
Yeah, I was a bit surprised actually to find out that the Sichuan region, which has been, so widely discussed of late with the shutdown, was actually primarily overflow of hydroelectric electricity is effectively free and clean energy, which I did not know.
Yeah, my take, and I've seen people that kind of focus on the Chinese grid more than I have, is that basically because China overbuilt a lot of things, and so you naturally had a lot of areas of inefficiency, all this kind of free energy, and so that Bitcoin's really good at going to that because it's one of the few sources of energy demand that can go to the source. Whereas most sources of energy demand, you have to bring the source to the demand. And so whenever there's an area of excess capacity, which is essentially free energy, it's otherwise wasted, miners can go there, get it for super cheap, and basically it doesn't really impact the environment at all. Now, over time, China's kind of working out the inefficiencies, right? So they do this thing where they'll build a ghost city, and we kind of point out that it's a ghost city, but then a few years later, it's not a ghost city anymore. Eventually, populations start trickling into that city, and so they overbuilt things, and then those efficiencies kind of get worked out. And so the same thing seems to be happening with their grid, where they're starting to make more connections, they're starting to tap into that excess capacity. And so my understanding is that that these inefficiencies are probably going to be arbitraged away in the long term anyway, or at least reduced. So hydro kind of always has that issue in some cases where it's always, if you can get near it, it tends, because it fluctuates with wet seasons and stuff, there tends to be periods of excess capacity. But I think China's huge excess capacity is slowly kind of going down anyway. And so as they connect the grid more, as they're able to make use of that energy, I think they in some ways wanted the Bitcoin mining out. But I think in the long run, it's not good for China, because I think it would be better, all of that, it's some of those machines, but also some of the personnel, some of the capital, right? So some of China's entrepreneurs are leaving or otherwise investing elsewhere, which I think is not great for the country in the long term.
Right. You talk about the ability of miners to go to the place where electricity is the cheapest or most abundant. How about volcanoes, right? What's happening in El Salvador and how important is it?
I think that's one of the most exciting news, because geothermal is one of the cleanest energy sources. Because even if you look at, say, solar or wind, they actually have a lot of environmental downsides as well. I mean, like when you take down solar panels or wind panels, we don't or wind turbines, we don't really currently have a way to recycle them, and so they just get thrown into landfills and things like that. And so there's still improvements being made in those areas, whereas and even hydro, for example, has it basically can damage the ecosystem, right? Because you're kind of cutting off river. And so it kind of reduces biodiversity, it can reduce coastal sediments. Whereas geothermal is actually one of the energy sources that, if you have the right environment for it, has almost no downsides. And so Iceland gets tons of geothermal energy, and any of these other kind of countries that exist on fault lines can get this pretty attractive low cost energy source that really has almost no downsides. And so the fact that El Salvador is exploring that, I think, is really bullish. So especially as this hash rate migration continues, there will be machines available, and so hopefully, either private miners or the state-based energy company there will pursue that. I think that's actually a really good potential energy source for El Salvador, because they have that attractive energy type, and it takes a lot of capital to say if you want to export your energies. Let's say your country, you have really good electrical generation capabilities. And then the question is, how can you monetize that? How can you benefit from that? And so, for example, Iceland has a lot of geothermal energy. And so the question is, well, how can we make use of that? We can't export it, right? Because it's a small island, and you can't just run like a huge like underwire like electrical transmission. And so what they do instead was aluminum, refining aluminum is a very electrically heavy process. It requires huge amounts of electricity. And so what Iceland does is they say, okay, send us your aluminum ore, and we'll apply our electricity to basically turn that into aluminum cheaper than anyone else could. And so by doing that large refining process, Iceland is essentially exporting its electricity indirectly. They're using it for a global competitive purpose. And so a similar use case would be Bitcoin mining. So let's say El Salvador says, okay, none of our, we don't have enough places where we could, build billions of dollars of electrical transmission infrastructure and export cheap energy. But instead, we could set up some Bitcoin mining operations near some of these geothermal, and we could start getting revenue from it. And then potentially, if we find another use for that energy, we have that already kind of developed, and we can just build local lines and kind of tap into that energy more. And so I think that's a win-win. I think that's, the fact that looking into that is almost as important as the legal tender law, in my opinion.